I'm from the inner city, and I mean, my parents are from Appalachian extraction, but you know, I'm barely a hillbilly, at least not by hillbilly standards. But when I moved up there, I started working in a restaurant, and there was this other guy working there named Howie Walk, and he was the busboy, and he was from New York, Brooklyn actually, although his family had lived in Pittsburgh and a few other cities in the east. So he was pretty much a big town urban guy too, but he really took a liking to Wyoming and had been working on a ranch and doing irrigating and stuff like that. So he hadn't bought a cowboy hat yet, but he was moving in that direction. And then he had come out to get a job working for an environmental group. He just finished college. He'd gotten a degree in forest ecology and was quickly finding that there's not many jobs for forest ecologists. They want people to cut trees down, not to people to study them and save them. And so he figured he could get a job for an environmental group, in the Rocky Mountains. But there were no jobs. So
hold on one sec. Now we're rolling.
Now,
so anyway, tell me, there's this intimate connection, I've heard, between the Yippies and Earth First. Tell me about that.
Well, I mean, when I had met these conservationists in Wyoming, they were all from the East, and they were living in the Rockies and pretending to be cowboys, but they really were, they were Yankees. And we were fighting the Forest Service mostly on timber sales, some oil and gas drilling. And I remember our first campaign was on this Dunor Forest, which is right up near Yellowstone National Park in the Absaroka Mountains. And there was a public hearing. And so we went to the public hearing, and we all got up and gave our little talks, about how we didn't want this to happen. And then we get done with the hearing, and I go, well, that's kind of cool. And then a few months later, they had gathered all the information, not just about the Dunor, but about all these other wildernesses, and they were supposed to give a proposal about what to do with all the wilderness in the U.S. on Forest Service land, which is about 20 million acres of wilderness. And all the conservation groups had gotten together and come up with a plan that they could all support. And it left a lot of wilderness out. In fact, it only asked for about a quarter of it to be saved. The rest, they were going to figure they could fight those fights later. These were the more popular areas, the more scenic areas, the ones that they had public support for. And the ones that nobody ever heard of, in which case, some cases were even more important from an ecological standpoint, from a wildlife habitat standpoint, or just really from a solitude standpoint, they were left out because nobody ever heard of them. We didn't feel like we could develop public support.
What year was this?
This was 1975.
Right.
So, they tried as hard as they could to get, this group of environmental groups, when they came up with what they called, I think, Alternative W. Alternative A was that they develop all the wilderness areas, and Alternative B, I think, was that they save all of the wilderness areas, and then there was all these other propositions out there. And the one that all the national environmental groups were supporting was called Alternative W. They didn't have that many for that many letters. It's just the W, I think, stood for wilderness. And so we were proposing Alternative W to the Forest Service, and they were supposed to take this input and then make a proposal to Congress. And then Congress, of course, was going to make a proposal that they turned into a law. But what they did is, the Forest Service, is they took our proposal and basically cut it in half. So we were asking for like 25% of the wilderness. Now we're down to 12%. Mm-hmm. And then by the time it got to Congress, they were proposing about 3%. And this was about the time I just met Dave Foreman, and he was working with the Rukus Society down in New Mexico. Howie Wolk was working with Friends of the Earth, and there was another guy named Bart Kohler, also living in Wyoming, who worked with the Rukus Society. He was their state wilderness coordinator. They were very disappointed by this whole thing, and then I remember the day that we went to the hearing at the Forest Service building, when they were going to tell us what they were proposing, and then they did exactly what we thought, which was propose a fraction of what was needed and, half of what we'd asked for. So we were really tired of, not being able to at least ask for what we wanted. And we figured it was time to make a break with all the big environmental organizations and start our own organization, one that could, say what we thought needed to be said. And then they wanted to do demonstrations and protests, although they talked a lot about having done demonstrations and protests. Nobody there had really ever done anything. Maybe when they're walking from one class to the other, they may have saw a demonstration in a schoolyard and hung out for a few minutes and maybe even chanted, but they were not organizers in that sense of the word. And so I was all, I thought that was a great idea. I was tired of going to hearings. I was tired of being polite, and the media was totally ignoring us back then. To get someone to write a story about some dinky creek, you'd have to get the outdoor writer up there and walk it with them, and then if you're lucky, a couple of weeks later, on section F of the paper, you might get, a third page story next to the obituaries. And from working with Facade and AJ and Dana and those guys, I knew that we could get in the media, but we'd have to be more outrageous. So we started the first direct action campaigns to save wilderness. I think our first one was down in New Mexico when they tried to bulldoze a road into a desert wilderness area. We just stood in the road and got arrested, but we were on the CBS Evening News that night. And then there was a big oil drilling rig that was going to be put up in the Grovant Range just south of Teton National Park, which was a big wilderness area that was left out of our proposal. And so we started organizing nonviolent resistance. We pulled up the survey stakes. We did a big demonstration. I think one of the first big demonstrations against the Forest Service. And then that was about the time James Watt was made Secretary of the Interior, which really radicalized the whole environmental movement. So our timing was perfect to start this group.
Because he was talking about how trees create pollution and things
like that.
Yeah,
he was just a lightning rod, and he really united all the people who wanted to save wilderness. And then he was such a bad tactician, I guess, in terms of public relations, that he easily turned most of the country against him. And so this was a very fertile environment for us to organize Earth First in. People were tired of the Sierra Club and all these groups, with their real wimpy, Washington-based strategies, and they wanted more, I think more militant, more grassroots-based strategies. So I had, some experience in this, having worked with the Yippies. And I wound up organizing most of these early campaigns. And the amazing thing is that they were successful. We were able to get the governor to withdraw his support for the Little Granite Creek drilling rig. We were able to get them to stop their plans to log in the Dunor forest west of Yellowstone, or east of Yellowstone. We were racking up some major victories, and at that point, things had kind of slowed down in Wyoming. There was not a lot to go, there was some big issues on the horizon, but immediately there wasn't much going on. And I just, I was getting kind of bored. I've been living in a small town for 8 years, and I thought it was time to get out and see the world. So I hitchhiked out to the West Coast, where the largest old-growth forest that was supposed to be in our wilderness bill, but didn't get in there, was slated to be logged. They were building a really long road called the Bald Mountain Road, and people have been fighting it for 10 years, and they just lost the final appeal. And, really the only solution that anyone could think of at this time was direct action, but nobody really knew how that would happen. So I drove I had this old, I think it was a 61 GMC motor home. We called it the Lumbago. And we got in that and drove out to Oregon. And I spent like 3 months organizing nonviolent blockades. And about 2 months into those blockades, I got a phone call from a lawyer who had just gotten out of college. And he goes, "Look, I think there's a lawsuit that we might be able to file that could stop this if we could only get some money for it." And I don't know where I'm going to get money, but I called up Andy Kerr at the Oregon Natural Resource Council, and he'd already talked to this attorney at that time, and they had been co-plaintiff on a suit with the Sierra Club before, and the Sierra Club forced them to drop the suit, so they didn't have any legal standing. They had basically opted out of the lawsuit, and they were looking for someone who could take up the lawsuit. So they put in the money. We signed on as the plaintiffs, and we took them to court, which is, kind of surprised me. I've never taken anybody to court before, and but we kept up the blockades, and we were having like 1 or 2 a week. Generally, 12 or 15 people would get arrested. Maybe 20 or 30 people would be on site at any given time. But we were making major television and newspaper news in the state of Oregon. Not much of it actually got out of state because it's pretty well bottled up in Portland. And they thought it was really a regional story and too polemic to be of any interest nationally. But we did rally a lot of support for the area in the state of Oregon. And then one night, as we were, sitting in the bar trying to figure out how to get our hippies out of jail, we'd forgotten that our lawyer had gone to court that day seeking an injunction against a lawsuit. And so we called him up, and he goes, "Yep, they shut the road down." So that was July 1st, and that was probably our biggest victory up to that point. And it was a multi-million-dollar road building project. It was a high priority for the Forest Service to fill in their backlog of timber that they'd sold, and it was one that nobody thought could be won.
So what year was this?
That was 1983.
And so Earth First existed then?
We started Earth First formally in 1979.
Right.
We had been working together on some of these issues, from 1975 up until then.
You and Dave?
Dave Foreman and Howie Wolk and Bart Kohler. And we had been reading Edward Abbey's book, The Monkey Wrench Gang.
Right.
And fantasizing about starting an organization that would really do that kind of stuff. But, sabotage is not really my game. I had an opportunity to do that plenty during the anti-war movement. We hung out with a lot of Weather Underground people who liked to bomb things, and I was willing to get arrested. I was willing to plan demos or be disruptive, but I didn't want to go to prison, and I didn't think it was a good organizing strategy, because when you do sabotage, it's really hard to recruit people, and then you have to be paranoid all the time, and then they really are out to get you. So.
But you did a lot of sabotage.
We never did that much. We made it look like we did a lot. I mean,
what happened to the $2 million worth of oil field equipment?
Well, that was before we started Earth First.
Oh, okay.
But yeah, we did.
That was freelance.
Well, I mean.
What years was that then? In the 70s?
That was from 75 to 79. We would go out to these seismographic exploration operations that they did. They were mostly helicoptered into the wilderness. There'd be a big shed that had all this electronic equipment in it, and then they would take these, what they called geophones, which are really just kind of large microphones, and they would bury them in the ground along like a 2-mile line, and they would make an X basically in the wilderness, and then they would take these sticks of dynamite and bury them along the line, and they would set off the dynamite, and then they would get the echoes off of the rock formations down below, and that would give them a pretty good indication where these formations were.
For oil. Those were the oil companies.
Yeah, it was actually natural gas.
Oh, okay.
So we didn't want these wilderness areas turned into an oil field, so we would hike out there. We would, pull up the geophones. We would cut the cables. We would sabotage the the little portable seismographic units. And then, when we caught all their trucks in a parking lot, we would cut the tires. One time they brought a whole seismograph crew in and actually had the nerve to put them in a campground inside Teton National Park. And Howie and I and this other guy drove out there in my pickup truck, and we spent all night cutting up their equipment while there was a guard sleeping in the guard station.
Were you afraid to get busted?
We were not that afraid. I mean, we were a little afraid. We were being very careful, and we had planned ways to get out. We had, food and water and stuff stored in the woods nearby in case we had to beat feet,
So it wasn't really oil field equipment. It was natural gas?
Well, it's the same thing. They do it the same way.
Right.
And a lot of times they get both gas and oil out of the same formation. These particular formations didn't contain very much oil, but they contained a lot of gas.
Where exactly?
That was the overthrust belt, which runs from northern Utah all the way to the Canadian border along the Montana-Wyoming border. Some of it's in Idaho. I had been working on, I started working on drilling rigs in 1975 because that was a good way to get money, and I knew a lot about drilling rigs. And but I didn't consider this sabotage per se. We weren't using any explosives. We weren't, threatening people. We were just tearing up equipment, and to us that was very different. But when we started Earth First, we realized that we're going to be very visible now, because one of the things that really distressed us about the sabotage that we were doing was that the press never reported it. It was always listed as vandalism, and the reason is because the people who did it were too afraid to tell the media why they did it. So when we started doing it, we would tell the press who did, we wouldn't tell them who did it, but we would at least let them know why they did it. But for instance, the instances I just described to you, that was when we were too paranoid to tell anyone, especially the press. So when we started Earth First, we figured, well, we will give a voice to those people who were doing that sort of thing. We knew we weren't the only ones. There was this type of activity going on all throughout the West. And with the same thing, it was not being reported, and I think mostly because the corporations that had been targeted didn't want it publicized, because they figured that would shine a light on the opposition to their projects, and it may encourage more sabotage. So when we started Earth First, we figured we would talk about sabotage. We would report acts that happened. We would even publish instructions on how to do it, but at that point we had to be a little bit more careful about doing it ourselves. And we did engage in some of that behavior after that, but we were much more involved in nonviolent protests at that time, and because that was the way to build a grassroots movement. You can only do sabotage with the people that you already know. You can't recruit new people to do it, because you don't know if you're recruiting a cop. And this eventually played out when Foreman was doing sabotage down in Arizona and got busted for trying to cut down a power line leading from a nuclear power plant.
Because he had a informant working with him?
He had an FBI agent by the name of Michael Fain. He had him over to dinner. He gave him money to buy a welder, and he conspired with him, and he was eventually arrested for it, and he eventually pleaded guilty.
Right. So, but you were saying that Tom Prasad inspired you because, or the Yippies inspired you because of that they were people who were willing to do these direct action tactics and really take on the police in a more mediagenic and confrontational way?
Yeah, they weren't afraid to talk to the media and to do things and to be outrageous and to be very confrontational. And even though they were a little bit paranoid, they didn't let that paranoia get in the way from doing what they wanted to do. So, they were, in some sense less militant than, say, the Weather Underground. They didn't believe in explosives, or they didn't, pack guns, or they didn't look like tough guys. They really were just a bunch of furry hippies. But yet they were very intimidating in many other ways. They could break into meetings, they could, trash things, they could start riots. That a lot of, really creative media events that got coverage. A.J. Weberman was, go through people's garbage and do a press conference about what he found in the garbage can, and these actions like, when record producers were making records for Bangladesh and none of the money went to Bangladesh, he would, go bring food and try to serve food at their corporate offices, because obviously they must be more hungry than the people in Bangladesh. And these things got attention to the issue, and more importantly, they kind of made it personal with the people who were making those decisions. They were very good at, singling out a person and trying to make their life miserable. And I think that was part of why AJ would go through their garbage all the time. We'd do demonstrations at their house. We would trash their car if we found it. There was just this ongoing intimidation and trying to, to put light on these people who were responsible for these things that we thought were, egregious.
Mm-hmm. But it's not like Tom taught you this stuff.
No. I mean, like I said, I worked on a couple things with Tom, but I worked on many things with all the rest of those guys, and I don't know how much influence Tom had on them, but I assume that he had some, because he did seem to have some stature in the Yippies when I got involved, and they did seem to listen to him, and I know he ran most of the meetings I went to where he was at. And
yeah. Was he inspiring?
To me, I was a young kid, yeah, he was one of the older guys. I did kind of, look up to him. But I was all mystified by the whole thing, and I was a little bit overwhelmed, and I was a lot quieter in those days. I was more of a worker bee.
Right.
And it took me a while before I kind of like came out of my shell and was willing, to do things on my own. And like I said, by that time, Tom had kind of departed.
To do high times.
Yeah.
Right. So what did you think when you found out he killed himself?
Well, I was in Wyoming at the time, and I picked up a copy of High Times and read about it, and I was really kind of bummed out about it. And but I had been out of touch with people for so long, I didn't even know how to get in touch with anybody. And looking on the masthead of High Times at that point, there was nobody left there that I knew. So, but it was sad, and I couldn't understand. He didn't seem like the kind of person that would commit suicide.
Yeah. Cool. Wait a sec, you said you don't know what you would have done if you hadn't met the Yippies?
Well, yeah, I mean, I just left home, and I was hiking around the country and hanging out with hippies and stuff, but I really didn't have a sense of purpose in my life, and I was opposed to the war too, but I didn't, I went to some demonstrations, but I never thought of myself as an organizer or an activist even, and it was basically by working with the Yippies that I learned how to be an activist, how to take control of situations and, and to organize people.
Yeah? Because, a lot of people today don't really know how influential they were back then.
Well, it's true. People know about Abbie Hoffman, and certainly, he deserves his place in history too, because he set a really good example, at least in the beginning. But and some people think, I've talked to people who've studied the Vietnam War a lot, and they think that really the Yippies were a bigger threat to people than all the other groups, because it was a cultural war that we were waging, and that we were really dividing society, and that we were really showing the absurdities of U.S. behavior in Vietnam, and that we really were, calling the naked emperor, and and I think those tactics still work today. I think we take them for granted a lot, but if you look at Earth First, our use of humor, our willingness to be militant, to not be afraid of things like property destruction and breaking the law, and then of just constantly hounding our targets, the people who were making the decisions. Those were all tactics that I learned, working with the Yippies.
Or now with Rukus, too.
Well, Rukus, we really focus mostly on tactical issues now, and that's what we teach. We teach nonviolent direct action. I think we're less into the cultural war now, although it looks like, from looking at Seattle during the WTO demonstrations and here at the World Bank, that there is a cultural divide developing around these issues, and there is a new counterculture emerging, and it's very different in some ways than the Yippie counterculture. There's I don't know, there's certainly less drugs and the music sucks, but other than that, there's a lot more piercing and tattoos, but really those folks that we saw on the street today really could have been Yippies.
Right. But also with the Rukus, you're focused on getting media attention.
Right. That's still, we think, the that's how you judge the effectiveness of your action, is how much attention does it get. And the reason for that is you want to get other people involved, and that you have a stalemate, or you're not making any progress at all because it's just you and the big corporation, or you and the government, and you don't have enough power by yourself to get things done. But when you do a very high visibility action, a very confrontational action, then you get the media's interest. They're interested in confrontation. They're not interested in research and reason. And then when you get on TV and in the newspaper, then people learn about the issue, and it's the issue itself that they become concerned about. They, with Earth First, and it's the same as the Yippies, that they didn't necessarily want to join the Yippies or want to run away and join Earth First, but they agreed with us. They thought that we were right, and I think we got grudging respect even from our enemies, because we were willing to stand up and say things and do things that the other groups wouldn't do. And those are clearly Yippie tactics.
Right. Well, learning the media spin, learning how to spin the media, what you do now with Rukus.
Yeah.
That was something. And people have said that Farsad was a master at that.
Yeah, he obviously was. All the campaigns that they worked on up till then were very successful, simply because they got a lot of media attention. And I think with Rukus also we learned a lot from Greenpeace. And it's not just about setting up events to get the media to, but it's how do you get the right picture? How do you get a picture that really tells the story? And when they were getting in front of whalers and sailing into nuclear test sites, those were the kind of things that really, really did resonate with people and really did inspire a lot of opposition. So I'd say that Greenpeace tactics had a really crucial role in, evolving the way that we teach things now. Right.
So you never, just hung out with Farsad and smoked a joint and shot the shit?
I smoked some pot with him. I didn't talk to any of those guys. I was too intimidated by him. I was just a young, fresh-faced kid, the new one on the block. And it wasn't until the inauguration of Richard Nixon that I'd actually organized anything on my own. And shortly after that, there were no more large demonstrations to go to, and I went to a bunch of Yippie meetings, and at that point, it just seemed like there was a lot of paranoia and a lot of arguing over silly things, and I just kind of lost contact. But part of it too is that I just needed to do something else with my life. I'd been, traveling around doing this with these folks for, a few years at that point, and I just really felt like I needed to get out into the wilderness.